Welcome to another episode of the Surfcast Podcast. Today we're going to be doing our monthly look back discussion kind of thing. But before we get to that, we're changing the name. We've been telling you that this is our monthly look backs. But, you know, when we first started it, we had one idea of the way it was going to go or the concept. And it's as with sort of the whole podcast in general, it's ever evolving. And we think it's going to be a little bit more applicable title, a little more beneficial for you if we start calling it, what we've come up with at this point, Lessons from the Logbook. Idea here that, you know, we're not just going to tell you, oh, hey, on this date we caught this, on this date we didn't catch this. We're going to look at what Jerry and I did in the last couple of weeks before we record, generally month to month, and pull out some of the interesting items, the things we learned, the observations, the experiences, positives, negatives, and relay that information. We think it'll be more, I know it'd probably be more entertaining if I was on the outside watching it than just hearing what you did or didn't catch. So hopefully that's going to resonate with everyone. And hey, if you got a better name for it yet again, feel free to let us know for this subject or any of the others. Because again, we want this podcast really to be for you, you know. Yeah. Like, sure, it's fun. You and I BS in here once or twice a week, but ultimately we're doing it for you guys, the listeners out there. So we're always open to your input within reason, and we'll listen to what you have to say, and we'll try not to argue with you if we know you're wrong.
That's right. We really want this to be, you know, insightful and entertaining, and not just a listing of statistics or dry. We did this and then that, blah blah blah. So these are the notables, the noteworthy, and the notables. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump into it here talking about the July experiences, which I'm going to get it right off the table to begin with. I essentially only fished half of the month because I was in Florida for ICAST for part of it, and I brought home ICAST COVID this year, and I spent the next week sort of recovering from that. So without dwelling on it too far, I missed half of the month, but nonetheless, I still got out, hit the surf because, well, you know, it's an addiction. You got to feed it. So I had a bit of a theme that I realized without planning it so much. I did a bit more fly fishing this month, but on those outings, it was never my first goal. So when I go chunking, my plan is to go get some bait, net the bunker, chop them up, go chunk. I always have a backup plan because you're dealing with a variable that you cannot control. You know, it might, just like, are the striped bass there? Well, it's the same thing with, is the bunker there? Are the bunker going to be where I hope they are on that night so that I can net a sufficient quantity to then use them in the surf as bait? And I found out this month that they were not. The striped bass were more predictable than the bunker were. So my backup was the fly rod, because I started something last year. The followers of Surfcaster's Journal might recall I was working on a little goal with a series of, I was looking at, trying to break 30 pounds with the fly rod in the surf, which I'm still working on. But it's that ongoing goal that I'm working on. And I felt, in order to sort of force my hand to put the time in, that if that was my backup when the bait wasn't there, that's what I would fall upon. So that's what it was. I actually fly fished the surf more in July than I throw standard spinning conventional gear. Didn't do terribly well, but I hope you can get from some of these discussions, I learned something along the way from each of these outings. I've gotten back into the fly fishing the last couple of years. I heavily resisted doing it in the salt, but came around thanks to Jerry and a couple other...
It's me. I brought him over to the dark side.
Yeah, it's not my primary focus by any means, but it's something that's been interesting. It's been an interesting challenge. And I'm doing a lot of it while, Jerry's helping a lot. Steve Colton's been helping a lot. A couple other guys, again. A lot of it I'm learning sort of on the fly for each of my spots. Much like I dissect a surf spot when I'm throwing spinning gear. Again, whether I'm chunking or plugging, what have you. I really dissect where I'm standing, where I'm presenting the lure, where I'm casting that chunk, how it's moving through the water. So I'm still working through a lot of that with the fly rod. Now, for those of you who fly fish, there's, other things that become involved more than just cast out and retrieve. There's how you're holding the rod, stripping, the stripping basket, all these things that I'm learning I quickly hate about fly fishing. So I'm trying to learn how to manage it. So that was something I really worked on this month. holding the rod seems so, basic. There's 100 different ways you can hold that fly rod as your fly is working across the current, what you want to do to it. Really, as I was thinking on the fly on some of these nights, much to the same degree it is with a spinning rod. If I'm throwing a needlefish, how I'm holding the rod as my needle swims across the current, as I'm retrieving it, the line angle, if I'm holding it high, if I'm holding it low, all of those things, there's parallels to that on the fly side that when I came back into this, I didn't even conceive were there. So it's making me also think about it when I'm using the conventional gear. Am I falling in too much to this method of working a plug across the rip this way or holding the rod this way and that way? And I think it's going to actually help make me even more well-rounded, because I know I've fallen into a trap in the past where, this produced here. This location was this tide in these conditions, and that's all I fish. And then I'd remember every so often, well, that's not the only time the fish are there. So it's been a very interesting and unexpected way to sort of re-look at how I'm doing all of my surf fishing, but centered and starting from the starting point is with that fly rod in my hand.
Yeah, so something interesting for people to think about, whether you're doing spinning or fly, is how are you holding the rod and how is that affecting what's going through the water in front of you, whatever it is. But I have an interesting follow-up question for you, and that is that when you set out to chunk, you have a certain pattern that you're going to fish. It's a tidal pattern, it's a wind pattern, it's a whatever. You know where you're going to go, obviously. Do you go to those same spots with the fly rod, or do you pivot to a different spot?
So what I set out to do, excuse me, when I started in 23 with the fly rod in the surf, my starting point was, all right, where have I produced large striped bass? Okay, I got a couple of locations in my mind. Let's say I had 3 right off the bat. And I said, well, what factors might, again, not knowing for sure, but like trying to, eliminate some of the dead water, dead spots, what might limit me from throwing the fly rod, whether it's, structure behind me, rocks, weeds, surf, where I'm standing, how I have to present, maybe distance from shore. So I took those, actually I probably started with 5 spots, let's say, and I whittled it down to 3. One, my first trip, I knocked off the board, said, okay, I was totally wrong here. What I thought was going to work wasn't. So now I've really got it down to 2 spots. And then from there, my starting point again was, all right, where did I produce well with spinning gear, throwing plugs? I started with the plugs. All right, well, this tide stage, I could, if I'm fishing 6, 8, 10 feet of water, I could get down. That's where I started. Well, it didn't work because I forgot that, my fly is not likely getting down 10 feet in the water column. So where I started is not where I'm at now. I've evolved dissecting these spots, sort of in the same manner I was with the spinning gear, but for what's going to be the most effective way to present the flies with present the flies that I didn't anticipate in the first place.
Well, so. Toby, that was all great information, but you didn't answer my question. How do you like that? How do you like that, Bob? When you set out to chunk, you have a spot in mind.
Yeah.
Do you then go, well, I didn't get chunks, I'm still going to that spot?
Oh, I'm sorry. So I thought you meant starting on the season. No,
Good answer. I bet people loved what you just said, but how dare you not answer my question?
So when I go to chunk, yeah, I am thinking it through. Though every spot that I hit this month, I was going to chunk it, and if I couldn't chunk it, that's where I went with the fly rod.
Okay.
I was applying,
nice.
I guess reversing it, where I started where could I fly fish tonight with these conditions and this tide? Can I also chunk those? I can. So yeah, they were the same spots, the same tide conditions. But I'll say because I didn't find any bunker and I only found, let's say, moderate success on the fly, it was one of those cases where the whole time I was every time I'd cast that fly out, if I had a chunk right now, I'd be hammering them. That was eating away at me.
Great. Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think we've covered this a little bit on the podcast, but you and I can't remember already. But, that's something we've talked about, just like our spots are our spots. And, a lot of them are more fly fishable than you might expect. And while they would definitely scare away your typical fly fisherman, I hope that's not offensive because I don't mean it to be. they're very accessible with the fly rod, and they're accessible because the fish are fairly close, and the things that make them fishy, and it doesn't really matter the modality. So that's kind of what I was wondering. I was wondering, like, you know, on that Wednesday night or that Friday night or the Monday, whatever the day was, you're like, I'm going to go chunk, but I'm going to the spot regardless whether I have the fly rod or not. So that's what I was
Yeah, absolutely. But again, I started looking at I started from the, will this work on my fallback? Because when my fallback was spinning gear, I already knew that if I couldn't chunk it, I could plug it.
Yeah.
So it didn't really matter. It was just, what is the ultimate best location?
Right.
But when I was factoring the fly, it might not have been the A++ spot for that night to fly fish, but it was still an A.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to go to a D spot and essentially waste my time. I don't need casting lessons. Well, I do, but I'm not forcing myself to do casting lessons at night. So yeah, they were all spots that regardless of whether I found the chunks or I ended up with the fly, that's where I was going on those nights.
Nice. So I have three. So if we're calling this lessons from the log, in prep for this, I thought about, there's three things that really stood out for me from my log, literally from my log. And since we're talking about it, and we spent a lot of time talking about it, maybe I'll limit a little bit what I'm about to say, but I actually think the most notable thing for me from July is also fly fishing. After my pessimism of June and how bad June was, July wasn't really any better, by the way. I would say, in fact, I mean, at least I had one 30-pound fish in June. I had no in July. So,
Maybe this month.
yeah. So, but that's not really the point. My expectations went down a lot in July. I said, again, we're gonna make this explicit. Fuck it. I'm gonna do what I want. I'm gonna stop worrying about I should go here, I should go there, blah blah blah. I fish my patterns, and I am one of those guys now. I wasn't always like this. I have my spots and they're what I want to fish. You know, I'm with Bill Wetzel. I'm with, you know, a lot of the North Fork, Long Island guys are like this. A lot of the guys in Maine and then the Cape and blah blah. You have your spots, and that's what you want to fish, and they're yours and whatever. And I really felt that in July. Actually, this is a fourth thing, because this isn't even actually what I was going to say. But one of the spots that I really love is pretty conducive to the fly, like what we were just saying. Most of the time I go with a spinning rod. I've been chastising and giving myself a hard time about not fly fishing it enough, because I do think that, you know, something really special could happen, like 40 pounds on the fly. I really, really believe it. I've had 40 pounders before there. I've had fish, 30, 35 pound fish that have come a rod tip off of where I stand. It really feels like it's the most obvious one for me to focus on. Well, one very bizarre thing that happened in July was, over the stretch of 3 or 4 nights, I had a lot of small fish in this spot. That doesn't happen except for in October. Sometimes in October it happens. And to have it happen in July was bizarre. And I was like, maybe it was the heat, but that didn't really make sense. Maybe there was some rain factored in, but that doesn't make any sense either. And I don't really know what was happening. It was very, very strange. And one night with the plugging rod, I don't remember exactly, but I must have had 40 or 50 hits. And I didn't land very many fish. And as soon as I switched over to something that was a little more conducive to the schoolies, I started picking them up. And so I was like, well, then I'm not doing that. I'm going to do something different. So I'm actively trying not to catch the fish that are in front of me, even though I'm complaining about not catching any fish. So anyways, that's what I was doing. And they were hitting the surface and stuff. And I actually texted you, Toby, and I said, my God, last night was kind of a nightmare. It was like 50 hits, and I think I only landed 10 or 12 fish. And you were like, sounds like a fly rodder's dream. And I went, oh yeah, he's right. Why didn't I think of this? So, interestingly, the next night I went back with the fly rod, and I had a fish that was in the teens. And, you know, a lot of fly guys, and myself included, like, that's a good fish in the fly rod. I got a great photo. And I was psyched, and I caught a few other smaller fish. And the next night I caught even more of those smaller fish. I don't remember how many I had. It was in the low double digits. Here I am talking about numbers, which is not really the point. But it was really fun. And honestly, I would have beaten myself up even about that. Had I not let go of some of the expectations, I would have been like, you don't have the 40 yet. You should be fishing here preparing for the 40 and not wasting your time, in air quotes, I'm air quoting right now, wasting your time with this fly rod, even though I love fishing with a fly rod, because I was actually texting with Alberto about this. I like trying to nail the swing and presentation of my fly and getting the ultimate cast every single time. Not as much as I like catching the fish, but I love it so much that I can stand there for hours and try to nail that. And I think bucktailers will sort of hear that and go, yeah, I know what that is. In an inlet, you're trying to nail that perfect drift. And when you nail it just right, and that fish comes because you know there's a rock right there, or there's this little hump, or you think there's this oyster bed or that sandbar, like nailing that is such a satisfying feeling. So that was my fly fishing experience. I said I wasn't going to talk about it very much, but I guess I did. And that, I think that was probably the highlight of the month for me. But two other things that came about because of the same mentality of being like, you know what, I have to change something. I don't like to change things. I don't like to say, oh, it's not working. I haven't caught a fish for a night or two or a week. I'm going to completely change everything. I'm going to start fishing new spots. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to run around. And I think that if you want to be successful long term, you can't do that. You have to bury yourself in your spots and in your patterns. But it gave me an excuse to begin to chip away again at another pattern that I worked on for a while, and I moved away from in the last couple of years. And I have been, to use the same word again, chastising myself for not trying to learn this spot in this pattern. It's more of a pattern someplace. And I didn't commit a ton of time to it in July, but I felt justified in going there because the fishing hasn't been good. And I was like, well, I might as well use my time productive to learn what's the current sweep, what does it look like at this tide stage, what does it look like at this wind, blah, blah, blah. And I had some slot fish on needlefish. So, I mean, I had some fish. It wasn't banner, and I felt like, okay, this was great. I was glad I was out there. And the final thing, just to keep rolling, is I started packing metal lips again. I said, you know what? I'm gonna give myself an excuse this month to say, every single time I go, I'm gonna carry three different metal lips of 3 different classes, and I want one of them to be a completely different size. So I was actually carrying a really small one, which I'll get to in a second. And I want to fish them at least, a reasonable amount of time, whatever that means, every single time I go. Because over the last few years, I've gotten away from using metal lips. There's no real reason. I think, Toby, you mentioned this in a recent edition, that, you get on long-term trends. I think we were talking about plug color.
Yeah, plug color, yep.
Dave has talked to me about this, that he gets kind of trendy. He gets really on something, and he does it for a while, and then all of a sudden he gets on something else, he does it really for a while. And, we have our patterns and our spots and those rhythms. But when it comes to, like, plugs, sometimes you get a little bit on something. Well, for a while I was really on metal lips, and I've really moved away, so I've been feeling that. I'm looking at my wall, and I've got all these beautiful wood plugs, and I'm like, I don't even fish these fucking things anymore. Like, what's wrong with me? So anyways, over the last month of July, I've been really trying to force those in. But force them in a very natural way, so I'm not being like, I'm going to just fish metal lips tonight. I really don't like that. I think, Toby, you've done that before, maybe with some things. I don't know, have you? I know Dave has, like, with needlefish.
Only when I was trying to learn something new.
Okay. So I don't even like doing it for learning purposes. But I did feel like, what am I missing? Or maybe just it means something to me, and I like fishing the metal lips. There's something about it. So I was carrying, most of the nights I was carrying a surface, some sort of medium diving. And then most of the time I was carrying my little hooker. I'll give the hooker plugs a plug. Plugs a plug. The little guy. And it's like an ounce. And they look exactly like the big ones. He builds them exactly the same. They look exactly like the bigger metal lip, but they're small. And I've caught a lot of fish on them in the past. Like a lot of fish. Hundreds. Nothing of any size note whatsoever. Nothing that Toby would want to catch or value at all. I'm just kidding, Toby. In the fall, I've had some fun bites with teen fish, maybe into the low 20 pounds, on these little plugs when they're on peanuts and stuff. Which is a whole nother discussion of, do they actually mimic a peanut? Because they actually thrum pretty good for what their size is. But it's a fun plug. So I started carrying those again. And it was fun. And I got to say, just that little bit of motivation on those nights being like, this is one extra thing. If nothing else, at least I'm out here trying to fish a metal lip. So like, even if it ends up sucking, even if maybe I should have gone somewhere else, if I shouldn't be here trying to learn the spot, and I should be over there grinding it out in my other spot because that's the long-term thing. Even if all that stuff's jumbling around my head, I can be like, well, at least I'm out here giving it hell with the metal lip because I haven't been doing that, and, it feels productive. And sometimes when it's bad, I really need those things. I need those, like, if nothing else, I'm doing this. I'm out here trying to get a photo. I got to take a setup shot for something. I want to get a photo of me in my wetsuit. If nothing else, I want to see what this looks like in this west wind. If nothing else, at least it's rainy tonight, and I feel like that's something different. Like, I have to set up these scenarios in my head to keep myself motivated. And for a lot of the month, it was just carrying those metal lips when I wasn't fly fishing, which I now feel much more enthusiastic about, which it sounds like you do too. So
I had a question off of the items that you listed there from, you're looking in your log for the month. I want you to predict, if you can, come December.
Oh God.
If you're in, we're in December, even if we're off the record, just BSing about it. Do you think any of those, which one of those do you think is most likely to still be something you're doing? It's something that is prevalent, that could be part of your November lessons from the log, like something that still comes up.
Oh, yeah.
4 months from now or whatever, 3 months.
I think the biggest lesson from the log for me with July was that, and I can't get specific here, I'm sorry for people, but in a particular wind that I thought might be difficult to fish with the fly rod, it's absolutely viable. And the viability of that condition now puts me into not just like B+, A- conditions, like, oh, this could be good, to A++, like fishing emergency conditions. And so knowing that now, going into the fall, we still have a whole month, but, thinking about the fall already, which is also a trap you don't want to get into, by the way, which is a whole nother thing maybe for us to discuss sometime. You just, when fishing is bad, you should not be trying to get to the fall. But thinking about the fall, knowing that this is possible, but I'd always been afraid to do it because I was like, it's going to be a nightmare and I don't want to waste these conditions with the fly rod. Knowing it's possible opens up a whole world of possibilities all season long. Not just in the summer, not just in the fall, not just July. So that has been a big thing for me. And again, this is the Surfcast podcast and not the Flycast podcast. But that's been a big eye-opener for me and something I'm very excited about. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast at surfcastpodcast.com, or definitely check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, at the Surfcast Podcast.